and welcome to Economics Unbound on this historic occasion of the opening of the National Parliament, albeit under altered circumstances. The President tonight sought to paint the picture of a nation challenged by a myriad of difficulties, but yet undefeated by the daunting strength of the storms that lie ahead. Today, I am joined by my colleague Frances Hurd. She and I will canvass the views, and an array of analysts and opinions will be sought. We have heard that a key component of the President's economic recovery plan is the release of spectrum, in line with the International Telecommunications Union's requirements. And this is done to empower ordinary people to participate in a fast digitizing economy and world. The President also talks of poverty alleviation and employment creation. We will speak to experts about it all and what they made of the President's attempts to instill hope and confidence using rather lyrical words. Frances.
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Thandeka. It's great to be here. And indeed, we were talking just before this kicked off. Maybe there wasn't too much new here. Some new announcements, for example, the extension of the 350 Rand grant that was a lifeline after the COVID-19 pandemic. It'll be hard to withdraw that. We'll talk about that with analysts. Not much new beyond that, but perhaps that is fitting because the President, over time, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, has laid out several plans. Were we ready for yet another plan? Rather, he said, let's look at accountability, what we have achieved. Now, the DA, we heard in response saying, look, some of these things haven't gone through Parliament, they're not legislated, but he was trying to give timelines on some issues, like you said, Thandeka, the spectrum issue, something outstanding, talking about the end of analog TV. By the way, if you live in some provinces, that could happen as early as next month. And then very interestingly, I mean, over the last year or so, we've been looking at American politics and how the US President, the former US President Donald Trump, was inward looking, talking about made in America, America first. And, you know, maybe that was an excess. Some people worried about trade restrictions coming up around the world. But we as South Africa, again, talking about making things here, localization. Well, analysts are concerned that the court action against ICASA's decision for auction of that spectrum allocation might cause further delays. That is an issue that the President raised. We don't want to hold things up because of what the analysts say. Let's take a look.
Welcome to Frances Hurd, Thandeka, and dear viewer. The potential of information and communications technology to stimulate national economic growth, along with the present worldwide demand for wireless services, the increasing use of new technologies has produced tremendous opportunities for improving the communications infrastructure of a country and the country's economy. Further, the ongoing technological developments have opened the door to a variety of new spectrum applications.
As we are saying, one of the things that the President did raise is the issue of spectrum. We will not only be concentrating on spectrum in this discussion, but we're going to open it up and discuss an array of issues that were raised by the President today. But analysts are concerned that the court actions against ICASA's decision to auction the spectrum allocation might cause further delay to the detriment of consumers. This is after MTN and Telkom launched separate court applications to halt the auction scheduled for next month. More spectrum allocation is aimed at making way for 5G technology, which could help reduce high data prices in the country.
The telecommunication industry has been waiting for over 10 years for more spectrum allocation to be provided, but Telkom and MTN's court action could further delay this process. Analysts say that the country cannot afford further delays in spectrum allocation, especially due to the escalating cost of data and the technological challenges that consumers are facing. More spectrum allocation will help expand 5G technology and ensure that communication is better and more efficient. It will also provide consumers with more stable, affordable and clear connectivity.
Poor people are paying prepaid rates, which tend to be the most expensive rates. The wealthy are paying prepaid rates for large bundles that actually bring down the cost of data dramatically. So the poor are unfairly disadvantaged. They're punished, in effect, for being poor and for not being able to buy large bundles. So they are paying the highest possible rates for data, while the wealthy are paying the lowest possible rates for data.
In a statement, MTN says it does not want to see a delay in the allocation of spectrum, but is fighting the decision to prevent bigger players from bidding in the first round of the spectrum allocation. On the other hand, Telkom says the planned spectrum auction is flawed and could enhance the dominance of Vodacom and MTN. Mobile operators have been calling for more spectrum to provide fast and efficient services to consumers and to boost economic growth. Prices of lower cost bundles came down significantly after the Competition Commission made a finding against both Vodacom and MTN in 2019 for charging higher data prices.
An important issue in spectrum allocation is that it has to be both fair to all operators, but it also has to be cost effective for all operators. So the cost of access shouldn't be prohibitive. That would allow smaller players to come into the picture. But at the same time, it's important to understand that to make full use of 5G spectrum, you need to be able to invest heavily, billions of rands in infrastructure. So it's not just the cost of buying the spectrum, but also of applying that spectrum. And if too much of the spectrum is given to too many small players, it means that we'll have very inefficient and ineffective rollout of 5G.
Goldstuck is not optimistic that the State of the Nation address will provide any meaningful solution to the matter, and has reiterated that further delays of spectrum allocation will have socio-economic impact on both consumers and businesses who will not be able to reap the benefit of 5G technology. Naledi Matlapeng, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, thank you, Naledi. Meanwhile, earlier the president identified 4 overriding priorities for his government for 2021. Delivering his State of the Nation address this evening, the president said defeating the coronavirus and pandemic was the first, accelerating economic recovery was the second, and introducing economic reforms and changing and altering the structure of the South African economy and fighting corruption were the third and the fourth. He said corruption was a key impediment to the country's growth. Ramaphosa says testimony at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry had laid bare the extent of state capture in South Africa. For any resource, including spectrum, and any primary economic resource, you basically need a government with a sizable set of policies to redistribute and to equalize in society. We are now joined by Kate Orkin from Oxford University.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Kate. Now, Kate, did you hear the president's speech? He said that they are extending the social grant somewhat and may begin to taper it off slightly as we go on and as the economy recovers. Now, you're an expert in that area of the impact of social grants and what do you think of the president's strategy? Do you think it will be impactful? Will it cushion societies, families, households? And what do you predict is the future of this grant?
So I think it's an absolutely excellent idea. South Africa has been among many other countries in the world, India, Brazil, Peru, Colombia. There's been a huge number of countries that have chosen to use their social protection systems to help the poorest people at this time. So South Africa has been completely in line with best economic practice in other places. I think we haven't talked enough about what an amazing thing it was that they've managed to roll this grant out quite well. They manage, I think it's between 5 and 6 million people have got a new grant. They did the registration online and it's been distributed very well. it builds on, a really strong social grant system that we had with the child grant and the pension. So I think, for me, government gets a great thumbs up for doing this extension. I think there are some questions about the grant even now. 350 Rand is not a lot. It's even less than what we call the food poverty line. So for an adult, they need to have 580 Rand a month to eat enough calories to survive. And we're not giving them that. And we know we've shed nearly 2 million jobs in the economy over the last year. So I think as we go forward, we have to ask a question about, for the very poorest people, are we giving them enough? And then I think the other big question in this is, the women who get a child grant don't have access to this unemployment grant. And we know the child grant actually goes to children as a beneficiary, not to the mother. So, strictly the mum should be, parents should be using that grant to get food and clothing for their children. But if they're unemployed, they also need to pay for job search and other things. And so I think there is a question about, can government going forward extend the unemployment grant to women as well? There's obviously a fiscal cost to this, but we know from from social grants around the world that this is an incredibly cost-effective way of alleviating poverty. So it's about the most efficient way that government can achieve that objective.
Now, Kate, before we move on to discuss whether South Africa is moving, in fact, towards a universal basic income grant, which has been discussed much at NADLAC, let's just take a listen to what the President had to say about the extension of the grants and related issues. Just take a listen.
This is no ordinary year, and this is no ordinary State of the Nation address. I will therefore focus this evening on the foremost overriding priorities that we have for 2021. They are not many, but they are focused. First, we must defeat the coronavirus pandemic. That is primary in everything that we have to do as a nation. And second, we must accelerate our economic recovery. Third, we must implement economic reforms to create sustainable jobs and drive inclusive growth. And finally, and not leaving many other things aside, but these are the key ones. And finally, we must fight corruption and strengthen the state that has been weakened.
Now, Kate, the President has been speaking previously about the possibility of introducing some form of basic income grant. In what way will it assist this economy to recover from COVID-19?
So I think there's two questions always with the basic income grant. So the one type of, the one question people ask is, should we be giving cash to people? Rather than food or job training or some other sort of intervention. And there, I think, the international evidence really suggests that cash is by far the most cost-effective way to get income to poor people.
What are you finding in your research, Kate? What do people tend to use the basic income grant on? I think I read something of yours where it says it goes a lot to food.
So it does go a lot to food, but it gives people flexibility, and that's the key thing. So, if people are subsistence farmers, then perhaps they don't need food. They need to be able to spend on something else. It's also very hard to distribute food. So, we saw with the food parcels at the beginning of the year that to make sure you get good quality food to people is actually hard and expensive. It's easier to send them money. And we've seen there's been hundreds of studies all over the world that show that giving money directly to poor people, even if you don't put conditions on it, over time, their children have better outcomes, they have better nutrition, they do better at school. Those people have better health outcomes, and it enables them to connect back into the economy. So I think in terms of giving cash, it's a really good idea. I think there is a difference, though, that cash doesn't have to be given to everybody. And so it's important not to confuse those two debates. A basic income grant is really about giving the same grant to everybody in the country. And that's a different debate from should we give cash grants to the poorest
And I suppose then
people.
it does assist in stimulating demand in the economy.
Yes, so that whichever, if it's just targeted cash grants or a basic income grant, there is some evidence from similar programs in Kenya that actually giving cash grants to the poorest people leads to an economic multiplier. So it does stimulate growth. People spend money in the economy, and then that helps producers in the economy. They earn more, and then they go on to spend that money. And that multiplier can be quite high in poor countries. Although we have some evidence on that from rich countries as well. So it can indeed be an economic stimulus.
My last question to you, Kate, what would you have loved the president to say that he didn't say?
I was watching to see if they were going to extend the special grant. So he did that already. I would have loved if it had been at the food poverty line, if it had been higher. But I think it was already really a step in the right direction. And I'm very happy that they've done that.
Well, thank you for joining us all the way from Oxford. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you for having me.
Now, my colleague Francis Hurd is going to be speaking to Professor Kenneth Kramer from the School of Economics and Business Sciences at Wits University. He is also a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Committee. Now, Francis, the president spoke about shifting the economy from a consumption-based footing towards production. Now, increasing production in the economy is going to be beneficial for South African exports and also for the economy in general. But can we increase production? Can we increase manufacturing and reverse the trend of deindustrialization on the back of such relatively high interest rates? Please canvass that question for me with Professor Kenneth Kramer. Francis.
Of course I will, Thandeka, and it was so interesting to me that he's talking about textiles again. I mean, this was spoken about years and years ago, that South Africa basically lost an industry because we opened up to competition from other countries in the world rather than protecting that industry. Now it looks like we're going back to really how do we lift industries? How do we make them competitive rather than opening up them to the forces of the global economy? But of course, we still want to be part of that global economy. How do we get that balance? As Thandeka said, we have Professor Kenneth Kramer from the School of Economics and Business Sciences at Wits University. Prof, what did you think about that? I mean, there was even, I think, quite a new goal announced to reduce imports over the next 5 years by 20%. Is that an ambitious target?
Hi, thank you very much. South Africa and the world are really going through an unprecedented health and economic crisis for the last year or so. March last year was when we got our first case of COVID, and what a different world it was. And I think we're very fortunate, if you watch the SONA tonight, to see that we are well led during this very difficult time. Around the world, we've seen the problems that can emerge if your political leadership is not serious, is not guided by science, and doesn't really work tirelessly to overcome the problems of our society. And that's one of my biggest takeaways from tonight, that we really have a very good leader in our president. And if you're watching him talking in the SONA tonight, it's obvious that he's doing the best that he can to guide us through this current crisis. And he did, as you say, map out many economic issues and health issues. He said, we as a people must unite and rise as a people. And I think that is a very strong message of leadership. He said the three main priorities for us would be, firstly, to defeat COVID. Secondly, to implement policies to ensure that our economy can be rebuilt and we can have reconstruction and recovery. And then thirdly, very importantly, that we root out the corruption that has weakened us and has been a cancer in our system. So I think that would be the background in which I answer the specific questions. And as you say, the economic crisis, the point that I really was interested in is that he's saying, well, we need to look at investment in infrastructure. We need to look at increased industrialization, the points that you were raising. And he spoke there about textiles. He also spoke about our automotive sector, which was a really interesting case study, that our automotive sector, Toyota and Ford, is seeing massive investments during this phase. And the basic economic logic is that if you have investment, you will have growth. And if you have growth, you will have jobs. And that is what we need to unite and rise as a people, as he says.
And in terms of that, I mean, he says buy locally. Let's be proud of locally produced goods. He spoke about sectors that have increased their exports, that are doing well, specifically in agriculture. So if we say we've got a localization strategy now, is it formulated? Is it viable? Is it going to work?
Yeah, I think the thing that really excited me about sorting out our local economy is that he gave a lot of detail about how to correct our energy shortage. You know, if we don't have enough electricity in this economy, we can't even think about local industrialization, exportation, import substitution. And he was very particular and specific about the timeframes and the objectives. You know, in addition to the COVID crisis, we have a crisis if your electricity is being turned off and there is load shedding night after night. And one of the key pillars of that economic and reconstruction and recovery plan that the government is putting on is that they will invest in new energy, particularly solar energy, wind energy, and also allow firms, cut the red tape so that firms can invest in their own electricity in line with the change, the transition that's happening the world over, where instead of building one big power station that serves this, or 10 big power stations that serve the society, you have hundreds and thousands of solar panels spread across the country, feeding into the national grid. And the national grid is how we manage the electricity system to ensure that companies and households, rich and poor, are able to get electricity. Once you have that basic in place of a reliable and affordable electricity supply, then really we can be talking about selling cars, making our own clothing. As the president said, he was wearing a suit that was made in the country. But that is a precondition for me to get that right. It opens up the world of possibilities around buying local production. And young people, he spoke about young people setting up companies, setting up startups, all of those things become possible.
Well, I mean, on that point, he spoke about the social compact that's been agreed to, the plan, the proposal to help Eskom out of its, some would say, impossible situation where it's trying to build for the future, but it's got so much debt that it's just trying to keep paying off that debt at higher and higher interest rates. And he said that we're looking at a proposal that's been on the table for a while. Is that fair enough that it's going to take a little bit of time? And please answer quickly.
All right, so I'll try and answer quickly. The social compact on Eskom is very important. It means that business, government, labor, and the communities have decided on how we're going to resolve our electricity crisis. And that is our listening president. He has a style, a democratic style, where he listens to all the participants and he comes up with a program to resolve the problem. So there will be a lot of changes now. Eskom will be restructured. It will be made into a transmission, distribution, generation company. And the market is going to be opened up for more investment in embedded electricity, as they call it. And I think that will help us to resolve Eskom's problems.
All right, thank you very much. Academic Kenneth Creamer from the School of Economic and Business Sciences at Wits University. We're about to take a short break, but you want to chip in there on Eskom?
I was just saying that if this social compact that has been arrived at with regard to Eskom is unsuccessful, it bodes ill for other social compacts in other areas. So we have to make this one work. And if this social compacting way of leading is going to be a successful part of Mr. Ramaphosa's legacy, then the Eskom one is crucial.
And is it fair enough that it takes a little bit of time? I mean, we still don't know where the money was going to come from. There was talk of maybe tapping into pension funds, finding some sort of way to shore up Eskom's balance sheet to deal with its debt. I guess it's a big issue. Is it fair enough that that can't happen overnight?
Well, it remains to be seen.
How
but
long
the longer
it
it delays, the more costly the problem becomes to the nation.
Exactly. All right, we take a short break and we'll be back with more.
Now, welcome back. On Skype, we have Mcebisi Ndletyana, Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you for joining us, Professor Ndletyana. Lovely to have you this evening. Tande. Now, that can't have been an easy speech. It began lyrically and poetically, and he sought to speak to every single South African and appeal to their heart and their sense of history, that we've overcome over our history numerous periods of devastation, hardship, and want, and we have prevailed. But he sought also to portray a country that is in charge of it, understands its problems, and is in charge of its own destiny. But that can't have been easy. The ANC is a tricky political machinery. There are many ideological contestations, walking between the neoclassical school of thought about how to approach the economic crisis, the Keynesians and the Marxists, all in one house. What can you say about it?
Well, Tadega, actually, I don't think it was an easy speech. We are going through a tough time. It's a difficult period. About 3 million people have lost jobs. I heard Kenneth Creamer earlier sounding very optimistic. I think he's one of the few people that have that level of optimism. But generally speaking, and on the other hand, you have this vaccine problem that apparently we didn't check when it would expire. And so it was always going to be tough because to lift the mood of the country, what you also needed to do is to make announcements about projects that are happening, not projects that still lie in the future. But in terms of ANC politics, I think the one encouraging thing, I think, Tandega, would be the focus on local production. Because that's what you need to create jobs. But here is a very important question there. Because if you limit our dependence on imports, how do you do that? Do you impose tariffs, or how do you
You mean, what's the instrument?
What's the instruments? Because part of the reason, for instance, our local industries such as poultry and textile kind of decline was because we opened up our markets, and our markets were flooded by these international products. And we are operating in a globally comparative economy where we are supposed to open up our borders. So how do you do that? So for me, that would be one of the key issues. But I think Labour, to answer your question directly, Labour would be very encouraged by protection. Well, I don't know if it's protection. Here's the thing, the instrument we don't know. But by the mere focus on local production,
presumably a degree of protectionism would lead to the protection of local jobs, as he did say.
We have been reluctant previously to impose some level of protection because, I mean, the Americans dumped their chicken parts into our market here, which is partly the reason why our own poultry declined. And apparently that was part of the trade agreements with the US. So what quid pro quo we will have to go into now as we seek to,
But presumably you do agree that we have to produce more than we consume as a people.
Certainly, and import less, produce more, not only for our local market, but for the international market as well. But you see, we also need to initiate new industries, especially industries where we are likely to encourage new entrants onto the market. Take traditional industries like dagga growing, for instance.
Yes.
Port has gone legal. And with that legality, we have discovered all sorts of products that can be produced out of dagga. And you have parts of KZN, Eastern Cape, where this is a traditional product pretty much. So why not? There was no mention of that.
And he did speak a lot about stimulating and boosting agricultural output and production. And there is the cousin to dagga, which is hemp, which if you smoke, you will get extremely disappointed. But I suppose that these new industries, like the hemp industry, like other new industries that are unique to South Africa, are in the plan to increase agricultural and industrial production. But I still sense a tinge of pessimism in your voice. What is this made of? What accounts for your pessimism?
The president said we are in an extraordinary moment characterized by pretty much a crisis. And therefore, we need not do things in the usual manner that we do. And yet, his announcements were pretty standard. Take the energy industry. I was expecting to hear that we have added so much megawatts or whatever it is onto the grid, instead of announcing projects that are yet to come.
And a shortfall.
Yeah, exactly. And the issue of spectrum, for instance, infrastructure to connect internet and also IT and all that. We've been talking about this, Thandeka, I don't know for how many years. And this is a government that is in a pretty difficult situation, and the pessimism is justified. They are reaping the fruits of their own bad work. So there's little goodwill that people have, and especially at the time when you had a president who was promising something new, but you still have bad things happening. It looks like he's not in charge. So to recreate a new sense of optimism, you must speak in a tangible way. This is what we are doing, especially because you are battling a high degree of pessimism already. People are sick, are dying. So they need some really good news, but not just news, but things that are happening. And so, yeah.
Yeah, on that note of needing some good news, I have to thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you very much. And now, my colleague Francis Hurd will be speaking to Gina Schoeman. But before that, the whole issue of local production. Francis, I would like to make you address.
You'd like to make me address?
Indeed.
Are we talking short, long, flared?
Take your pick.
All right, I can't wait. And if you make me a dress, I promise to wear it on air. Well, let the viewers assess your local skills. And that was one of the themes coming through again and again, localization. But the analysts there saying, what does that mean? Are we going to start protecting our industries? A bit of pessimism there. We are joined, as Thandeka said, by Citibank economist Gina Schoeman. Ms. Schoeman, how are you feeling? Optimistic or pessimistic after that address?
Look, it's difficult to find a balance between the two. I'd say I was expecting something a little bit less than what we got. And what I mean by that, it was a bit more direct than usual, a bit more business-like. It centered around 4 priority areas, certainly something we can, digest and monitor. I think there were 2 standout points for me, the one on energy supply, and then secondly, the one on social grants. Everything else, we've heard these plans and promises, and I'm not saying they won't occur, but we take an approach that we have to see it to believe it. In other words, if all of these plans and promises for reform and accelerating growth and exclusive growth, if they truly do start to show up in the economy, well, the data will show it to us, and we'll gladly be able to upwardly revise our forecast. But the 2 standout points for me was energy supply and very much so social grants.
Yeah. And so a lot of people are picking up on this. I mean, he didn't give new promises. He actually said that quite explicitly. I don't want to stand here and give new promises. I rather want to report back. I think if we had laid out a whole new plan of action, that would have added to the pessimism. Do you agree? Because we've had so many plans of action, so many rescue plans, recovery plans, often, like you say, talking about the same thing. So was it good in that aspect that it wasn't a new plan, but what you're saying is that we need more metrics and greater accountability on the things that have already been announced?
Exactly, and a way to track them and monitor them in a more microwave. Let me give you an idea here. In the same way we had the supplementary budget in 2020 because of the pandemic, why not have a second SONA this year so that we can update on how the recovery is going halfway through the year? It wouldn't be bad to get a biannual update on these things, a kind of second State of the Nation address, because I think it pushes for that accountability and credibility. But yes, I'm always encouraged not to have yet another plan that I have to draw up another spreadsheet for in order to try and track and monitor, however difficult that is. But that is one area that, again, I get back to the energy supply, is that he emphasized what has happened. He emphasized the planned maintenance, which is quite counterintuitive to talk about, given that we've just been through load shedding. But the planned maintenance has been picking up in South Africa, which is a good thing. And even though that comes as a near-term cost of additional load shedding when unplanned maintenance happens at the very same time, this is the goal, to do enough planned maintenance so that shortfall that you mentioned earlier doesn't actually arrive in South Africa. But look, it's very early days. So again, we will monitor this and see whether it starts adding a bit more upside to our GDP forecast trajectory.
And he did talk about, this isn't new either, municipalities will be able to buy directly from independent power producers. Could that be a game changer? A lot of energy experts asking, why can't companies, big companies, just produce their own energy if they have that capacity? Why is that not happening yet? Do you think there's been a clear reason as to why we're opening up municipalities but not going even further?
Well, I think it's also very politically driven, and this is where we need to start speaking to the Minister of Energy and see how much he's willing to support all of these. But it is a first step to allow the municipalities to do it. We just obviously have to watch out for how municipalities typically operate and process things and make sure there's not a heap of corruption on that side. The capability of each municipality will determine the ability to do that. But yes, I think, allowing big companies to do it is certainly, it's a great initiative, but just remember that will then start to take away a certain degree of revenue from Eskom. So it's a very difficult balance here between allowing independent electricity generation versus trying to look for a smooth transition for Eskom's financials. And that's what I think gets so tricky for them. You've got Eskom on one hand who says they want one thing. You've got the Department of Energy on the other hand who says they want something entirely different at times. And that's where we need the clear leadership. So that's why we'll be monitoring all the commitments made on energy supply. But for now, we can at least see that planned maintenance has picked up in South Africa.
All right, thank you very much, Citibank economist Gina Skuman there. So many questions still to ask, but luckily Thandeka has another one of our esteemed economists coming up.
Yes, joining us on Skype is the CEO of Pan-African Investment and Research Services, Dr. Iraj Abedian. Thank you, Iraj, for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening to you and our viewers.
What did you make of the president's speech? What stuck out for you?
Well, some good messages and some repetition of old promises. That has become the hallmark of the president. What stuck out for me is that the president is becoming more focused on short-term delivery deadline, as opposed to promising that in the near future or soon or as soon as we can do. Instead, he said by April this will happen. That will be done by the second half of this year. That's promising, and that's a change of tack, because we're living in a very exceptional, economically stressed and stagnated conditions. We cannot do business as usual. And the president has been, over the past 4 years, really trying to do business as usual, be presidential, promise, talk the good talk, but leave it to others to deliver. And as he now acknowledges that the capacity of the state does not warrant this type of promises, they cannot deliver. Some of the ministers are compromised, they don't know how to, or they are incompetent, or both, and they just don't know what urgency means. They are politicking around the vital policies that the president has to come to the parliament and lecturing his own ministers and his own members how important some policy reforms are. And remember, this is the top executive of the country. He is the CEO of the country. He got to come and say, this is what we have decided, not to come and say policy reform is imperative, but we should do it. If we don't, we can do it. A good example of it is in the energy sector.
Yeah.
After so many years of promising and acknowledging that job losses, economic stagnation comes in, and still the president seemed to sort of be constrained. He talks as if he's not in charge of energy policy. I heard your previous discussions around energy. Quite frankly, not only municipalities, everybody who has capacity subject to regulations, meaning environmental compliance and all other regulations, they got to produce and then get the economy going. Now, and why is the government controlling this sector? I cannot understand it. Why do they get in the way of job creation? Why do they get in the way of GDP growth? If the Minister of Energy is out of it, he should be called out. If anybody else is within obstructing, including ESCOM, they should be called out because they are causing economic stagnation.
Now, the president did say that, well, he did make a huge admission that during these past few years, during which his party has been in charge and has been the ruling party, the state was gouged out, was hollowed out, and its capacity to live up to the constitution has been severely weakened. Now, that is quite an admission for the leader of a ruling party to say that that is what has happened. But he has to make it at this stage because it's so patently clear to every citizen that there is something wrong with the capacity of the state. Now, in economics, there are two schools of thought about institutions and the economy. Some economists like Douglas North and others say that fragile institutions lead to weak economic performance, and that the difference between economies that succeed and those that fail are the strength of institutions. And then there are some, like Hajun Chan, who say that it is the other way around. The causality is the other way around. Underperforming economies create fragile institutions. What do you believe?
I believe there's another element to our South African situation, is that not only our institutions, and more specifically institutions, meaning government departments, state-owned enterprises and municipalities in particular, not only they are fragile and not fit for purpose, they have been made so not because our economy was not performing, not because our economy didn't have the capacity to perform, because the political leadership intentionally made them fragile. They hollowed out. They sacked all the capable people. They hired incompetent people. Now, that's a variation on the theme.
So it's a failure of politics rather than economic performance.
Absolutely. So if we go into, and I fully agree with your observations, if we fail to recognize this, then we take the responsibility of the cabinet. If the president and the cabinet come and acknowledge, and it's a very positive acknowledgement that they do it, and as opposed to denying it, if they accept that our government institutions and state-owned enterprises don't have the capacity, and we all know why. We lived through it 10 years. We watched it to be hollowed out and be stolen in the daylight. Then the first step is for the president to come and say, as he promised, and he has not delivered on it. He promised when he took office to say, we are doing an audit of government departments. We are doing an audit of capabilities, necessity, and the usefulness of these departments. Since then, he has not delivered on that. He has to come to the nation and say, I did an audit. It took longer than what I thought. These departments will be scrapped. These departments will be integrated. These DGs have been retired because of whatever. This top layer will be replaced and will be capacitated with very transparent process of rebuilding them. We can't keep saying they don't have capacity and nobody gets sacked. We can't say there is corruption and no minister gets sacked.
Well, we can talk about the hollowing out of the state for many, many years. Thank you very much for joining us. And now Francis has yet another interview for us. And take it away, Francis.
Thanks, Thandeka. Let's get some more reaction. Chief Economist at Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jamin. Dr. Jamin, do you agree, talking about capacity and the state? He spoke about municipalities, saying that people will be competent. And this is also an argument that's been going on for years and years, talking about political appointments at municipalities. But he said there will be no more messing up. Do you believe the president?
Well, he had no option but to say that. I totally concur with the view that the president actually doesn't know quite how to improve the capacity of the state. He's identified that that is a big problem in terms of the service delivery, but he doesn't quite know how to actually tackle the problem. And it's a problem that has been created over many years, and I don't know that you can turn it around in a hurry. And that is at the heart of the criticism that people are leveling at whatever the president says, and that's all, all these ideas are all very well, but we're waiting for implementation. And if you can't get implementation because the state doesn't have the capacity to implement, then one is in trouble.
Yeah. And do you agree that would involve him showing leadership and actually firing ministers, say, who break lockdown regulations or show sheer incompetence?
Exactly. And I mean, the one point that John Steenhuisen, the head of the DA, said is, as long as he's got people who have been accused of corruption remaining as ministers within the cabinet, no one's going to believe that we're going to have implementation of these economic policies.
All right, the rest of the speech, Azar, the good and the bad for you?
Well, the good is that, the president comes across as a president. He has got a certain aura and charisma that lends one to respect him, and that it was very positive. It came through once again. But, I didn't expect too much out of the SONA. I wondered what there could be that was new, for the simple reason that a lot of this ground has already been covered on a number of occasions in the very recent past. The very economic recovery and reconstruction plan that he presented in October was followed up by the ANC celebratory speech on 8th of January, and they both contained very similar messages, and exactly the same issues were covered yet again today, and that's what I expected. The only thing that I did expect that might be new and did come about was the decision to extend the social grant for unemployed persons who can't access other grants, and the decision to extend the TERS scheme to help those who've lost their jobs in those businesses that are continuing to take strain. I think that's probably wise, even though it's going to cost the fiscus more money. An extra quarter of social grants of the kind we're talking about, 350 Rand a month, will cost the fiscus about 7 billion Rand extra. And I don't know what the TERS mechanism is going to cost. It's conducted through the UIF. It'll be a few billion as well. Within the broader scope of the fiscus, that is not huge and will not break the bank, so to speak. And it's essential, and people will applaud this as a temporary measure to actually, I mean, it's a measure that actually is very important for 6 million people. So let's not minimize the importance thereof, and at a relatively small cost to the fiscus. So that was very positive. And more generally, he addressed the issues that need to be covered. Energy security, broadband spectrum, fighting corruption and state capture. He covered all of those, but he has done so in the past. And yet we still waiting for it. We're waiting for those licenses to be freed up, the access to licenses for independent power producers to be freed up. We're waiting for spectrum to get underway, and we're still waiting for it. We're still talking about it, and we're still waiting to actually see it materializing. And I think that's the frustrating part of this.
All right, thank you for your analysis tonight, Chief Economist at Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jamin. And Thandeka, I guess we're hearing that same rallying cry again. Don't talk about pipe dreams or great plans, but how they will be implemented.
Indeed, and the issue of the capacity of the state is very serious, but I believe that solving the unemployment crisis and getting a hold of the our response to the COVID-19 primary. Well, Francis, I have got Dr. Natasha Valley. She's a lecturer in the Department of Sociology. I'll be speaking to her in a moment, and I'll put the questions of unemployment with her. But Francis, as you know, going into the COVID-19 period, we already were seeing those quarter-on-quarter figures for unemployment just rising, and the levels of employment plunging in our country. It was alarming even before we had to deal with the COVID created unemployment. And for me, one of the surefire signs of economic mismanagement is having a massive unemployment problem, the highest in the world.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking how many people are simply not able to put food on the table because they're not earning anything, if they're not with that 350. And I think he was talking about small businesses being bolstered to create jobs, but also that enabling environment for big businesses. And do you agree? I mean, I think there was a recognition there that big business, we don't want it to be this way. We want small business to be the engines for growth, but big business right now is creating the jobs.
Yes, and there were problems, significant problems with the ability of small and medium businesses to access the grant and the money that was set aside for them to thrive during the, to survive during the COVID-19 period. But Francis, I really must thank you for joining me this evening in assessing the state of the country and the state of the nation on this a very historic occasion of the President, President Cyril Ramaphosa, delivering his State of the Nation address 2021.
Well, I must say thank you so much for having me on your show. It's great to work with our esteemed economics editor, Thandeka Mbule, as always. And I guess that's a wrap. That's all we have time for.
That's it.
Ciao.
Go 19 Mawet.